what's in the box. Now, this may seem like just an ordinary box of kitchenware, but I can assure you this is anything but. This very box right here was originally sent to me by a friend in Germany and is filled with hundreds upon hundreds of floppy disks, all mysterious files on them, mystery game files if you will. And since then, my collection of weird and retro gaming goodies has only grown. And that's why I'm here today, because you'll never know what we find in the mystery game files. You know, I'm oddly proud of that title drop. Friends, I have a question for you. Who remembers floppy disks? Now, for channel analytics or anything to go off of, probably none of you, but that's okay. Back in the days before CDs, floppies were the medium of choice for storing data and games for PCs. Well, unless you're unlucky enough to be European, in which case you probably use cassette tapes. Most of these floppy disks were either 5 1/4 or 3.5 inches in size. Unless, of course, you were Nintendo, in which case you used 3-inch discs. But as the old saying goes, it's not the size that matters, it's how you use it. But wait, some of you are probably a little confused. Nintendo? Why yes, in Japan, Nintendo released this, the Family Computer Disk System for the Famicom, the Japanese version of the Nintendo Entertainment System. That's right, you could play Nintendo games off of floppies. I'm Jamie from The Gamer, and this is the Mystery Game Files. Today's look, Famicom Disk System. That time Nintendo released games on floppies. The Japanese version of the NES was the Famicom. Looking like a transformer adorned the same shade of red as a midlife crisis Corvette, it definitely fit in with popular Japanese electronic stylings of the time. Released in 1983, the Famicom swiftly crushed its main competition, Sega's SG-1000. And when it was redesigned to look more like a VCR and released in North America as the NES 2 years later, it became an absolute phenomenon. Along with the system redesign though, the NES's cartridges were redesigned to look more like 8-tracks. This had a secondary benefit as well. Back in Japan, Famicom cartridges did not have a set standard for shape or even color. This led to Famicom carts coming in every color of the rainbow, with some cartridges having additional sound chips built into them, or even lights. On average though, they were only about half the size of their overseas counterparts. Around this time in the early 1980s, games were becoming bigger and bigger. Popular high-score based jaunts and single-sitting experiences were giving way to games that could potentially take days to beat. Over in the US, some game carts started to ship with physical save batteries inside of them. Back in Japan though, the technology just was not there to both have a battery and keep cartridges small. Nintendo also had another issue. By 1985, over 3 million Famicoms had been sold in Japan alone. There was so much demand that it was often difficult to keep up with supply. And some folks are complaining about the cost of games. Thus, Nintendo looked into potentially releasing games on a tried and true, cheaper, non-cartridge format. TLDW, cartridges were expensive, and at the time they couldn't allow for game saves. In comparison, discs were cheap, and you could save games. Now, we'll take a look at some of these games later, but for now, let's take a look at the disk system itself. Look at that big old box right there. It's nice and silver and yellow and even features my favorite Nintendo mascot. No, not Mario. I mean Discoon. Opening it up, we'll see it actually comes with not one, but 2 different manuals. One is just a traditional setup guide, but the other is actually a wonderfully done manga-style introduction to the FDS. That's actually really cool and charming, and pouring through its pages makes me really excited to power this thing on. Of course, before we can turn it on, we've got to both give it power and connect it to a Famicom. Now, this power supply here is not stock. Actually, the FDS originally did not ship with a power supply. Nintendo felt that they could get away with selling this separately, since you also have the option of potentially powering your system with 6 C-cell batteries. Now, as comically stupid as that whole battery thing may sound at first, I do understand Nintendo's reasoning here. Unlike Sega, who would later really not give a shit how many power supplies your Sega Genesis would need, Nintendo seemed to realize that most Famicom owners at the time would only have access to 2 power outlets. And of course, one of those would be used by a TV and the other by the Famicom itself. Not everyone would have a power strip or whatever on hand, and by having that option to power the FDS with batteries, Nintendo was just making it more usable by more people. Also in the box is the RAM cartridge. You ram this RAM cartridge into the top of a Famicom to connect the disk system to it, and then games will not only be playable, but also able to take advantage of some additional RAM. Or they would if my FDS wasn't slightly broken. The FDS contains a belt-driven floppy drive, and over time the belts wear down until they have to be replaced. Thankfully, new belts are cheap and easy to get a hold of, and all it takes to get into an FDS is removing a bunch of Phillips head screws. Then just remove the old belt with some pliers and lots of isopropyl alcohol since mine kind of disintegrated, and then slide the new one into place and bam! Anyways, let's finally hook this thing up and play some games. Now some of you may be asking, Jamie, what's that behemoth of a console behind you? Well, this is the Sharp Twin Famicom, and this was created by the Sharp Corporation, not Nintendo. This was released only a few months after the original FDS, and it's a combination unit that can play both Famicom cartridge games and FDS games. No additional cables or hookups or anything required. Granted, like the original Famicom, it does have hardwired controllers, and though comfortable, the cables on these things are just abysmally short, but it's just a thing of beauty. Also, despite having no Nintendo logos or markings on it, this was officially licensed. The Twin Famicom is also odd for another reason. Despite everyone calling the Famicom, well, the Famicom, Nintendo was never able to actually use that name themselves. The full name of the system is the Family Computer, and you will never see Nintendo refer to it as anything otherwise. That's because the right to the name Famicom were owned by Sharp. While this didn't affect the later Super Famicom, which would become the Super Nintendo in the West, the only models of the original Famicom that used the name Famicom were Sharp's versions of the system. You can even see this when we boot up the Twin Famicom's disk system. Also, despite having both a cartridge slot and a disk drive, you can't use both at once on the Twin Famicom. If you're in disk mode, the cartridge slot will lock, and if there's a cartridge inserted, you won't be able to switch to disk mode. This also means that, if you have a disk system hooked up to your Twin Famicom, you can't use 2 different disk drives at once to prevent disk swapping in bigger games. Can we just take a moment to admire how cool these games are to look at? Most of them come on these yellow floppy disks, and they all have the word Nintendo engraved on the bottom of them. Now that was actually intended as a form of copy protection. If you have a game disc that does not have that engraving, in theory it should not fit inside a Famicom Disk System unit. However, bootleggers would later find out that if you just make a disc and blank out this section, it'll fit no problem. You gotta give Nintendo points for creativity though. Games couldn't just be bought at stores either. I mean, sure, you could go buy a retail release game for the equivalent of about $25, but why do that when we can be way more economical? For around $20, you could buy a special blue Famicom disc, which you could then take to a special disc writer kiosk. From there, you could download new games to your disc for as low as $3.25. Sure, some games such as Castlevania 2 were so big that they could take up both sides of a disc. But a lot of games were small, and in many cases you could get away with having one disc with 2 different games on it. Of course, regular yellow FDS discs were also rewritable. This was probably cool at the time since you could just write over your old game when you were done with it, but this also makes collecting for this system an absolute pain nowadays. You might buy a game thinking you're getting Metroid, when in reality you're getting Backgammon. And yeah, on the topic of Metroid, there are some really major titles that helped drive FDS sales. Among them was the original Metroid, but that wasn't the only one. The disk system launched with a little game called the Hyrule Fantasy. This would later make its way to the Western NES as The Legend of Zelda. Along with that also came the likes of Bubble Bobble, Bomberman, Zelda 2, Wrecking Crew, and even the original version of Super Mario Bros. 2. There would even be some Mario game variants that you could find on no other platform. There was All Night Nippon Super Mario Bros., a remix version of the original game with stylings based off of a popular Japanese radio show, and an exclusive variant of the Mario Bros. Arcade game titled The Return of Mario Bros. Most infamously though, there is an original title called Doki Doki Panic. Due in part to criticism of Mario 2's high difficulty, Doki Doki Panic would later be reskinned and re-released on cartridge overseas as Super Mario Bros. 2. This was despite there already being a game called Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan that Nintendo just didn't want to release at the time, but that they would later release anyways overseas as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. So, if Famicom Disk System games were so cheap and cool, why didn't this thing take the world by storm? Or at the very least, why didn't we get an equivalent to it for the NES? Well, the answer is simple. These things were obsolete within a few months of launch. Sure, the FDS was definitely not a failure. Nintendo sold over 4 million of the things in just a few years. But shortly after it was released, a port of the arcade game Ghosts and Goblins was released for the Famicom. A cartridge-based port. In fact, that version of Ghosts and Goblins came on a massive 128 kilobyte cartridge. By 1989, Famicom games were coming on cartridges that could not just hold much bigger game files, but that, thanks to the ongoing tireless march of progress, could now support save batteries. The FDS was basically dead by the end of the 80s. As for North America, many of the great FDS games would just be released on cartridge. Sure, this came with caveats for some of them. Games that use the additional sound channel would have their music scaled back, and the likes of Metroid would have their save system replaced with an old-fashioned password system. That's not to say the FDS was never planned for a North American release. Nintendo of America just eventually decided against it. Okay, you know what? It's fun fact time. Let's take a look at this NES here, the standard North American NES. And if we turn it over, we'll see that there's a little unused expansion port here. Now, this was included because at some point, Nintendo of America was considering releasing a version of the Famicom Disk System in North America. And of course, nothing ever came of that. And this is why we can't have nice things. Though the Famicom Disk System would never leave Japan, I think it's definitely one of the most unique things Nintendo has ever released. For all its flaws, it's definitely a case of a game company willing to think outside the box to try to provide better, cheaper products for its customers. This is just a type of thinking that, in my opinion, is much rarer nowadays. It's also a system that would have an impact on Nintendo. Most infamously, Nintendo would later begin talks with Sony and then Philips about developing a CD-capable add-on for the Super Nintendo. This was codenamed the PlayStation, but formatted as 2 words. These talks would fall through and would lead to Philips creating some god-awful Zelda games for the CDI and Sony releasing the system we now all know as the PlayStation, but formatted as 1 word. Okay, let's end this off with something that's going to blow your mind. For this past bit, I've been playing the ambient background noise that you'd usually hear on a GameCube's home screen in the background. But what you might not realize is that that noise is actually a Famicom Disk System reference. Here, let me demonstrate. I'm going to play a Famicom Disk System startup, and then I'm going to play a GameCube's home menu sped up 16 times. Craziest damn shit I've ever heard. Had the FDS released in North America for the NES, would it have been a success? Well, honestly, I don't know. Sure, it was a hit for the first few years of its life in Japan, but by the early 90s, it was basically obsolete. Cartridge tech had just surpassed what floppies could do. Famicom carts could have save batteries built into them, and game sizes could be way bigger than back in 1983. And all of that without the need for flipping disks or enduring load times. This wouldn't be the last time Nintendo experimented with floppy disks though. In 1999, they would release the Nintendo 64 disk drive for the N64. And that thing would only have a handful of games released for it, and it would be a massive flop. I mean, goodness, you could only get the damn thing through mail order. The FDS also debatably kicked off the late 80s/early 90s trend of game consoles having add-on hardware released for them. I mean, if it weren't for this thing, the likes of the Sega CD could have never been released. Trust me, a world without Night Trap isn't a world worth living in. What the FDS represents is ambition. It was an ambitious piece of hardware with some ambitious games released for it. The likes of The Legend of Zelda and the original Metroid are classic titles, and if it weren't for the FDS, they might have never been made. The Famicom Disk System is weird. It's odd, retro, obscure, it never saw release outside of Japan, and yet, I'm really glad I pulled this out of my mystery game file, because I think it's well worth remembering today. So with that, what gaming oddities should we cover in the future? Can we all agree that the Famicom looks way cooler than the NES? Let us know down in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to The Gamer for more great content like this. With that, I'm Jamie, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.